For 10 years, my son never called me. Not on my birthday, not at Christmas, not even on the anniversary of his mother's death. Then, 3 weeks before Christmas, my phone rang. Dad? I almost dropped it. That one word was enough to make a 68-year-old widower forget every unanswered call, every returned birthday card. Every year I spent wondering what I had done so wrong that my only son could erase me from his life. So when Evan invited me to Christmas dinner, I went. Before we ate, my daughter-in-law, Lauren, pulled everyone together for a photograph. Dad should stand in the middle, she said. I actually believed I was being welcomed home. Then dinner started. Questions about my company, retirement, whether I still owned everything, whether I had ever considered selling. Finally, Evan smiled across the table. Dad, family takes care of family. I put down my fork. Funny. For 10 years, I wasn't your family. Nobody moved. Then I added, last week, I turned down a $27 million offer for my company. Evan's face went blank. Lauren stopped smiling. Wait, my son said. You turned down what? That was when I should have left. Instead, I stayed long enough to discover why they had suddenly remembered I existed. And what I eventually found was worse than a son coming back for money. They had been using my name before I ever walked through their door. Even that Christmas photograph wasn't what I thought it was. But by the time they understood the mistake they had made, I was no longer the father they could abandon, summon, and spend whenever they pleased. My name is Samuel Whitaker, though most people have called me Sam for as long as I can remember. I was 68 years old that Christmas, a widower, and the founder of Whitaker Architectural Millwork, a commercial woodworking company I had spent nearly 4 decades building outside Grand Rapids, Michigan. I had buried my wife, Helen, 10 years earlier, and not long after losing her, I lost my only son in a different way. By the time I pulled into Evan's neighborhood that Christmas afternoon, the sky had already turned the dull gray that comes early in a Midwestern winter. His street was lined with brick houses dressed in white lights and wreaths, the kind of neighborhood where every driveway had been shoveled before noon and every front porch looked ready for a holiday card. I sat in my truck longer than I should have. There was a wrapped bottle of wine on the passenger seat and a small gift for Grace beside it. I had spent 20 minutes in the store deciding whether a 17-year-old girl would think the bracelet I chose was too childish. That was the problem with missing 10 years. You remembered a little girl with 2 missing front teeth, and then one day you were buying jewelry for a young woman you barely knew. I checked myself in the rearview mirror, straightened my collar, and nearly laughed at what I was doing. I had negotiated contracts worth millions without rehearsing a single sentence. Now, I was rehearsing how to say hello to my own son. The porch light came on before I reached the door. Evan opened it. For a second, neither of us moved. He was 42 now. There was gray starting near his temples, something I had not expected. His face was broader than I remembered, but when he pressed his lips together before speaking, I saw the boy who used to stand beside my workbench asking whether he could sand scraps of maple. Then he smiled. Dad, come in, you're freezing. Dad. I stepped across the threshold before my face could give away what that word did to me. Lauren appeared from the kitchen wearing a cream-colored sweater and carrying herself with the same polished confidence I remembered. She hugged me quickly. Merry Christmas, Sam. We're so glad you came. Then Grace walked into the hallway. The last time I had seen my granddaughter in person, she had barely reached my chest. Now she stood almost as tall as Lauren. Hi, Grandpa. Her voice was cautious, but there was a small smile behind it. Hi, sweetheart. I almost said, you got so tall. It seemed like the sort of thing an old man said when he had failed to be there for the growing. So I handed her the gift instead. Before I could even Wait, nobody move yet. We need a picture. Evan laughed. Lauren, I'm serious. We haven't had everyone together in forever. The word everyone caught me. She arranged Grace beside me, then motioned Evan over. Sam, stand here. I started toward the edge. Lauren shook her head. No, Dad should be in the middle. Dad again. Evan put his hand on my shoulder. Grace moved closer on my other side. Lauren set the phone on a small tripod near the fireplace, hurried into place, and the timer flashed. For 1 second, I forgot the years between us. The camera caught all 4 of us smiling. I looked at the picture afterward longer than anyone else did. That's a good one, Grace said. Yes, I said. It is. I meant more than the photograph. Dinner smelled like rosemary, butter, and roasted turkey. Helen used to put too much sage in her stuffing, and for half a second the scent carried me back to our old kitchen before illness and silence had taken up so much room in my life. I kept the memory to myself. Conversation began carefully. Weather, traffic, Grace's school, a neighbor whose inflatable Santa had collapsed in the snow. For the first half hour, I almost believed we might get through an entire meal without touching anything sharp. Then Evan asked, "You still going into the shop every day?" "Most days." "At 68? I haven't received a memo telling me I'm finished yet." Grace smiled. Lauren laughed politely. "I thought you might be thinking about retirement." "Some days." Evan cut into his turkey. "You still own the whole company?" "Most of it." He nodded slowly. Lauren picked up her wine. "I always assumed a company like yours would get acquisition offers eventually." There it was, not a demand, not even an inappropriate question by itself, just another pebble placed on the same side of the scale. "We've had interest," I said. "How serious?" Evan asked. I looked at him. He immediately gave a small shrug. "Just curious." I had spent my career sitting across tables from people who claimed they were just curious. Usually they wanted something. Still, I told myself not to do what I had done too many times when Evan was young. Not turn every conversation into business. Not assume the worst. Not retreat behind numbers because feelings were harder. So I answered, "Serious enough." Lauren leaned forward slightly. "Have you ever considered selling?" "Yes." Evan stopped chewing. "And?" I said no. Lauren's eyebrows lifted. "Recently?" "Last week." The table went quiet enough that I heard the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Evan looked at me differently. "How much?" I should have refused to answer. Instead, perhaps because I was tired of being treated like the same man they remembered 10 years ago, I said, "27 million. Grace's eyes widened. Lauren lowered her wine glass. Evan stared at me. "You turned down $27 million?" "Yes." "Why?" That was the first question anyone had asked that interested me. Before I could answer, Lauren said, "That's an extraordinary amount of money." "It is." Evan sat back. Something had changed in the room. Not dramatically. Nobody raised a voice. But the Christmas warmth suddenly felt thinner. A few minutes later, while Lauren cleared plates, Evan looked across the table at me. "Dad, family takes care of family." My fingers stopped around my coffee cup. There were dozens of answers I could have given him. Most of them had been waiting 10 years. Instead, I set my fork down beside my plate. "Funny," I said. "For 10 years, I wasn't your family." Grace looked at her father. Lauren stopped halfway to the kitchen. Evan's expression tightened. Nobody answered. Dessert came anyway. Lauren served pecan pie as though the conversation had never happened. Evan talked about football. Grace asked me what kind of wood I liked working with most. I answered her, "Maple." Always maple. For a few minutes, I let myself enjoy talking to my granddaughter. Then Lauren cleared the dessert plates and returned carrying something from beside her chair. A dark blue folder. Thick. Professional. The kind of folder I had seen across conference tables my entire adult life. She placed it directly in front of me. Then she folded her hands. "Since we're finally a family again," she said, "there's something Evan and I hoped you'd look at." I rested my hand on the blue folder but did not open it. Something about its weight, the careful edges, the way Lauren had placed it squarely in front of me brought back another folder on another table, 10 years earlier. That one had been cheaper. Plain brown cardboard. Evan had dropped it on my kitchen table less than a month after we buried Helen. I remembered the folder more clearly than I remembered half the words we said that night. Maybe that was because objects were easier than memories. Helen had been sick for almost 2 years before she died. Cancer has a way of shrinking a family's world. At first, you still talk about vacations and birthdays and projects at work. Then appointments multiply. Medicines appear beside the coffee maker. There are good weeks and bad weeks, and eventually the good weeks become good days. I loved my wife. I also failed her in ways I understood better after she was gone. When I was frightened, I worked. Whitaker Architectural Millwork had been my answer to almost every problem for nearly 4 decades. A customer canceled a contract, I worked harder. Payroll looked tight, I worked harder. A machine broke down. I stayed until midnight. When Helen got sick, I told myself the company needed stability because our family needed stability. That was true. It was also convenient. There were mornings when Helen was waiting for test results, and I still answered calls from the shop before I asked how she had slept. There were afternoons when Evan came by and found me sitting beside his mother with a legal pad on my knee, checking production numbers while she rested. He hated that. "You're here, but you're not here," he he told me once. I had looked up from the page and said, "Somebody has to keep things running." Helen had closed her eyes. Evan had walked out of the room. Later that evening, Helen said, "He isn't asking you to quit your job, Sam." I know. No, you know the words. I'm not sure you know what he means. That was Helen. She translated us. When Evan was young, she explained to him why his father missed dinner during a major installation. Then she explained to me why a 12-year-old boy did not care that the installation was worth 6 figures. When Evan was older, she could tell when his anger was really disappointment and when my silence was really shame. After she died, there was nobody left between us. The house was still full of sympathy cards when Evan came over with that brown folder. Grace was 7 then. Lauren had stayed home with her. I made coffee neither of us drank. Evan put the folder on the kitchen table and said he had a plan for his future. I remember asking questions. Too many questions, probably. I remember him getting defensive. I remember myself becoming colder every time his voice became louder. That was another bad habit of mine. When somebody became emotional, I became practical. Numbers, dates, risks, facts. I could make calm sound like punishment. Finally, Evan stood up. "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" "Choosing the business." I looked toward the folder. "This isn't about the business. It's always about the business with you." "That's not fair." He laughed once, without humor. "Mom's not here anymore to make it sound better, Dad." That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else from the argument. There was more said after that, things neither of us should have said. But grief had made us both sharp, and I spent years remembering my own words more clearly than his. Evan left. For a while, I believed we would cool down. I called 3 days later. No answer. I called the following week. He answered that time, but we spoke for less than 2 minutes. After that, the spaces between conversations grew. I mailed Grace a birthday card, then a Christmas card. The next year, I sent a small wooden jewelry box I had made myself. I remember sanding the lid twice because the first finish was too dark. There was no thank you call. I told myself 7-year-olds did not make phone calls, so I kept trying. Birthdays, Christmas, Easter once or twice. A school year card when I guessed she might be starting middle school. Some things disappeared into silence. Later, a few packages came back unopened. I still remember seeing my own return address on one of them. That was the day I stopped sending gifts. Not because I stopped caring, because I finally convinced myself that pushing harder would only make things worse. Evan had been angry with me for years before Helen died. I had missed dinners. I had taken calls during vacations. I had taught myself to provide for people more easily than I learned to sit still with them. So when my son shut the door, I treated it like a sentence. Maybe this was what I owed him. Maybe the decent thing was to accept it. 10 years later, sitting at Evan's Christmas table with Lauren's blue folder under my hand, I realized how much of my life I had built around that belief. Grace was still watching me. She glanced at the folder, then back at my face. Her expression was not angry. It was confused. "Grandpa," she said quietly, "why did you stop trying to talk to us after Grandma died?" Grace's question landed harder than anything Evan or Lauren had said all evening. I opened my mouth, but Evan answered first. "Grace, not tonight." She looked at him. "I was just asking." "I know. But Christmas dinner probably isn't the time to dig through 10 years of family history." His tone was light, almost reasonable, but it closed the door before I could put one foot through it. Lauren stepped in smoothly. "Sam, why don't we show you what we wanted you to see?" She opened the blue folder and turned it toward me. The first page showed a brick commercial building wrapped around a landscaped courtyard. Northline Development Group was printed across the bottom. Evan leaned closer. "It's a mixed-use redevelopment outside Naperville. Retail on the first floor, offices above, and a small event space in back." I turned the page. There were site plans, cost estimates, projected rents, photographs of the property, and a construction timeline. Whatever else I thought about my son, he had not brought me something scribbled on a napkin. "What's the total project cost?" I asked. "Just under $7 million, Evan said. Lauren smiled. "And before you say anything, we're not asking you to rescue us." That word caught my attention because nobody had accused them of needing rescue. "We've already put together the debt side, our own capital, and outside money. We're very close. This is an investment opportunity." I flipped to the financing page. "How close?" Evan glanced at Lauren. "We need about $1,300,000 more in sponsor equity," she said. I looked up. "That's your definition of close?" Evan gave a short laugh. On a $7 million project, yes. What has the lender actually approved? They're still working through final underwriting, he said. They liked the project. That was not the same thing as approval. What do they need before closing? Lauren tapped the page. Proof that the remaining equity is in place. We're hoping to get everything finalized right after New Year. I studied the schedule. Aggressive, but not impossible. Evan watched me. You always told me not to be scared of a big number if the underlying deal made sense. I also told you a big number becomes a very big problem when the assumptions underneath it are wrong. His mouth tightened. For a second I thought we might slide back toward the old argument neither of us had ever finished. Then Lauren turned another page. This is why we wanted you to see the whole picture. There were photographs of the neighborhood, demographic charts, traffic counts, and glossy before and after images. She was good at presentation. The deck made the project feel inevitable, and experience had taught me to distrust anything involving millions of dollars that felt inevitable. Then Lauren said, Helen would have loved this. My hand stopped on the page. She always believed family should build something that lasts, Lauren continued. This could be 3 generations creating something together. I did not answer immediately. Helen had helped me when Whitaker was little more than rented shop space and 3 men working too many hours. She had answered customer calls from our kitchen and kept records when I was better with wood than paperwork. I knew what she had given our family. That was precisely why hearing her name inside an investment pitch bothered me. You knew Helen a long time, I said. Lauren's smile faded slightly. Yes, then you know she didn't make business decisions for people after she was gone. Evan leaned back. Dad, nobody's trying to manipulate you. I didn't say you were. You didn't have to. Grace looked between us. I closed the folder. I'll review it. Lauren brightened. So you're interested? I said I'll review it. Evan exhaled. Fair enough. No promises, no handshake, no assumptions. I'll read everything and tell you what I think. That's all we're asking, Lauren said. I wasn't sure I believed that. When I left, Evan carried the folder to the door. For one hopeful second, we stood there like a father and son ending an ordinary Christmas visit. Drive safe, Dad. There was that word again. This time it did not warm me quite as much. At the hotel, I made coffee and opened my laptop at the desk beside the window. Lauren had included a link to the digital presentation. I downloaded it and began reading from the beginning. The electronic version contained several pages that had not been printed. One was titled Capital Structure. I read the lender information first, then the outside investors. Then I saw my own name, Samuel Whitaker. Founder, Whitaker Architectural Millwork. Beside it were 4 words. Anticipated Family Equity Partner. I stared at the screen. I had learned about the project less than 4 hours earlier. Then I checked the file information. The presentation had been created 3 weeks before Christmas. My son had been talking about my money before he ever called me Dad. I sat at the hotel desk for another 20 minutes without touching the coffee beside me. Seeing my name in the presentation was one thing. Seeing it attached to money I had never discussed was another. I had spent too many years in business to react before I understood exactly what I was looking at. So I started over, not as Evan's father, as the man who had spent nearly 4 decades reading contracts, purchase orders, construction schedules, and financial projections. I opened the file properties first. The original presentation had been created 3 weeks before Christmas. Several revisions followed. Each version had been saved under Northline's company account. Then I searched for my last name. Whitaker appeared 9 times. Most were references to my company or experience. One slide described me as a possible strategic advisor. Another mentioned potential family participation. Farther down, in a section covering sources of capital, I found the phrase anticipated family equity. The wording was cautious. That bothered me more than if it had been reckless. Nobody had written that I had signed anything. Nobody claimed money had already changed hands. Every sentence left enough room for someone to say they had merely been discussing possibilities. But those possibilities had existed on paper before anyone discussed them with me. I saved a copy of the presentation to my laptop and wrote down the dates on the hotel notepad. Original file. First, revision, financing update, Christmas invitation. I did not know yet what those dates meant. I only knew I wanted them in the right order. The next morning, I drove back toward Michigan. Snow had begun falling somewhere east of Chicago, light enough not to slow traffic much. Normally, a long drive gave me room to think. That morning, I kept hearing Evan say, "That's all we're asking." By the time I reached Grand Rapids, I had decided not to confront him yet. If there was one lesson business had taught me, it was that anger had a way of answering questions before facts got the chance. 2 days later, my office phone rang. Mary Ann had already gone home, and I almost let it roll to voicemail. Samuel Whitaker? Yes. The woman identified herself as part of the underwriting team working with Northline Development Group. That got my full attention. She explained carefully that my name and Whitaker Architectural Millwork had been referenced in materials connected to Northline's proposed redevelopment financing. "We're verifying several sources of sponsor equity before the file moves any further," she said. "I'm glad you called." There was a pause. "Have you made a financial commitment to Northline?" "No." "Has Whitaker Architectural Millwork made one?" "No." "Have you authorized anyone at Northline to represent that you or your company will provide funds toward the remaining equity requirement?" "No." I heard keys moving on her end. "Thank you. I need to clarify one statement because it specifically references you." "All right." She read it slowly. "My father is prepared to support the equity gap once we finish the family side of the discussion." For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. "Who wrote that?" "I can confirm it was contained in correspondence from Evan Whitaker, not Loren." "Yvonne." I leaned back in my chair. "When was it sent?" She gave me the date. "More than 2 weeks before Christmas. Before I had been invited to dinner, before the photograph by the fireplace, before the blue folder, before anyone had asked me for anything. I need the record to be clear," I said. "I was not prepared to support any equity gap. I didn't know there was an equity gap. I understand. And nobody at Northline had authority to speak for me or my company. I'll note that." She explained that the loan had not been finally approved. Northline still had to establish its actual equity sources before closing. My name had been presented as an expected possibility, not as verified cash. That distinction mattered. It also told me Evan had known exactly how far he could lean without making a promise on my behalf that anyone could easily enforce. After the call, I wrote a short statement confirming what I had said. No investment commitment, no corporate commitment, no authority granted to Evan, Lauren, or Northline. I sent it to the underwriting contact and kept a copy. Then I sat alone in my office as evening settled outside the windows. For years, it had been easier to blame Lauren. She was polished where Evan was emotional. She spoke about money comfortably. She could turn pressure into something that sounded like common sense. Some part of me had quietly decided that she must have pushed him into this. It was a comforting explanation. My son had come back because his wife needed something. My son was still somewhere underneath it all. But Lauren had not written that sentence. Von Hut. He had told strangers I was prepared to help before he had even asked his own father whether I wanted to. For the first time, I stopped asking what Lauren had done to my son and started asking what my son had chosen to do himself. I did not call Evan that night. I waited until the next morning, when I knew I could speak without letting anger do the thinking for me. He answered on the 4th ring. "Dad, I spoke with your lender." Silence. Not surprise exactly. More like calculation. Then he said, "Okay. They quoted your email to me." Another pause. "Which email?" "The one where you said I was prepared to support the equity gap." He exhaled. "Dad, I never said you signed anything. That wasn't my question. I said I expected you'd help once we talked. That's different. To you, maybe. It is different." I stood by the window of my office, looking out over the parking lot behind the shop. A delivery truck was backing toward the loading doors. Men I had known for 20 years were moving stacks of finished millwork under the gray morning sky. "Evan, you told a lender I was prepared to provide money before you had even asked me. I told them my father was likely to support me. Most people don't think that's a crazy assumption. Most people ask first." His voice sharpened. "You know what's crazy? Spending my whole childhood watching you pour everything into that company, watching Mom help you build it, and then hearing you act like none of what came out of it has anything to do with us." There it was again, the old accusation with new numbers attached. "I never said it had nothing to do with you. You didn't have to. Your mother's sacrifices mattered to me. They should matter to you more than that." I closed my eyes for a moment. What does that mean? It means she gave years of her life to Whitaker. We all did, in one way or another. I heard movement on his end, then Lauren's voice farther away. "Put me on speaker." A second later, she was there. Sam, I think this is getting framed in the worst possible way. I almost laughed. Then frame it for me. Lauren's tone stayed calm. Nobody forged your name. Nobody represented that funds had been transferred. The lender knew family participation was anticipated, not finalized. You're describing why you think you were technically careful. I'm asking why you thought you had the right to do it at all. We were positioning the project with my name, with the expectation that once you saw the numbers, you'd understand the opportunity. So you created the appearance of my support first and planned to get my agreement later. That's not what I said. It's exactly what you said. Evan cut in. Dad, this is how deals work. You build confidence. No, you build confidence with money you control and commitments you actually have. The line went quiet. I sat behind my desk. Listen carefully. From this point forward, neither of you uses my name in a financing discussion without my written permission. Dad, no. You wanted clarity. Here it is. I picked up the statement I had sent the lender. Whitaker Architectural Millwork is not participating in Northline's project. You are not authorized to describe my company as a source of funds, collateral, liquidity, backing, or future sale proceeds. Lauren said, Nobody said collateral. Good, then correcting the record should be easy. Evan's voice turned cold. You're enjoying this. That one hurt more than I wanted it to. I'm not enjoying any part of this. You always get like this when you have the upper hand. I have the upper hand because it's my name. I heard Lauren whisper something to him. Then Evan said, So what do you want us to do? Correct anything that implies I committed funds. In writing. That could make the lender nervous. They should have accurate information. What if it damages the deal? I looked at the family photograph Grace had texted me after Christmas. I had printed it that morning without quite knowing why. If the deal is damaged by the truth, I said, then the truth isn't the problem. Evan ended the call a few minutes later without saying goodbye. For the rest of the day, I tried to work. I reviewed a hospital millwork package, signed payroll documents, and walked through the finishing area with Mary Ann. She could tell something was wrong, but she did not press me until late afternoon. Christmas go badly? I'm still deciding. That sounds like yes. I gave her the shortest version I could. When I finished, she leaned against the filing cabinet. Are you thinking about investing anyway? I looked at her. She knew me too well. I'm thinking about everything. Those aren't the same thing. Before I could answer, my office phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was not. I picked up. The man introduced himself as an executive with the investment group that had made the $27 million acquisition offer the previous week. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time, Mr. Whitaker. What can I do for you? We received an unusual inquiry yesterday and thought it was better to come directly to you. My grip tightened around the receiver. What kind of inquiry? A woman named Lauren Whitaker contacted our office. I said nothing. She explained that there had been changing family circumstances and asked whether our acquisition proposal could still be reopened if you were more receptive now. For several seconds, I could hear only the blood beating in my ears. I had never told Lauren who made the offer. I had never asked her to contact anyone. I had not even decided whether I wanted to speak to that buyer again. Yet somehow she had found them, and she had started a conversation about selling the company I had spent nearly 40 years building. After I thanked the man and ended the call, I remained seated with the receiver still in my hand. They were no longer just counting my money. They were trying to decide how I should create it. I was still sitting in my office when Grace called. At first, I thought something had happened. She had never called me directly before. Not once. Seeing her name on my phone felt so unfamiliar that I stared at it for 2 rings before answering. Grace? Hi, Grandpa. Her voice was quieter than it had been at Christmas. Everything okay? Yeah, I think so. That answer usually means no. I leaned back in my chair. What happened? I was looking for old pictures. Pictures of what? Mostly when I was little. I need some for a school thing. I heard cardboard moving on her end. Mom keeps a bunch of boxes in the garage. I found one with Grandma's name on it. My chest tightened at the mention of Helen. Grace continued before I could speak. There were pictures in it, and some cards. I said nothing. They have my name on them. What kind of cards? Birthday cards, Christmas cards. A couple envelopes looked like they had something thicker inside. Then she said, They're from you. I sat forward. Are you sure? I recognize your handwriting from the card you gave me this Christmas. For a moment, the office seemed unnaturally still. What dates are on them? She read several aloud. I remembered every one. One had been sent the year Grace turned 9. I had bought a card with a watercolor horse on the front because I remembered Evan once mentioning she liked horses. Another came 2 Christmases later. Another had been mailed when she turned 12. I had written inside that one that I hoped middle school was treating her kindly. I remembered standing at the post office counter with it, remembered putting the stamp on myself. "Have they been opened?" I asked. "No." That word did something to me. Not anger at first, something heavier. All those years, I had imagined my cards reaching a house where nobody cared enough to answer. I had never imagined they might have reached the house and stopped there. "Grandpa, I'm here. Dad told me you stopped sending things." I rubbed my forehead. Some of the later packages had come back to me. I knew that, but these had not. "How many did you find?" 6 cards, maybe more. There are other boxes. Don't go digging through them." She went quiet. "I'm not telling you to ignore what you found," I said, "but I don't want you searching your parents' things for me. I'm not searching for you, I know, and I want to keep it that way." She sighed. "What am I supposed to do? Ask them." "Dad?" "Yes. What if he gets mad? That's between him and me. You don't have to protect either one of us." That was something I wished somebody had told her years earlier. Grace said she would call me later. She did. That evening, my phone rang again. This time Evan was already angry. "You told Grace to confront us?" "I told her to ask you about cards addressed to her. You had no business dragging her into this." "She found them, Evan. You don't know the context." "Then give me the context." Lauren's voice came through in the background. "We were protecting her." I closed my eyes. "Put me on speaker." A second later, Lauren said, "Sam, she was a child. You and Evan weren't speaking. We didn't want you appearing every Christmas or birthday and then disappearing again." "I didn't disappear. You weren't part of her daily life. I wasn't allowed to be." Evan cut in. "You stopped calling. Eventually." "Exactly. After years of getting nothing back. That was your choice." I looked at the dates I had written down from Grace's call. "No. Some choices were made before mine." Neither of them answered. I kept my voice level. "Why did you keep the cards?" Lauren said, "Because we didn't want Grace getting attached and disappointed." How could she be disappointed by a grandfather she was never allowed to hear from? Silence again. Then Grace's voice came from somewhere in the room. "Mom?" Lauren said quickly. "Grace, go upstairs." "No, please. I want to know." Evan sounded tired now. "This is complicated," Grace said. "You told me Grandpa stopped sending cards. He did eventually." "That's not what I asked." I could hear the strain in her voice. Nobody answered. A few minutes later, the call ended badly. Evan told me we would talk another time. Lauren said Grace needed space. I did not call back. Near midnight, Grace sent me a text. It was the Christmas photograph from Evan's living room. All 4 of us standing together, me in the middle. Beneath it, she had written, "This is the first real picture I've ever had with you." I looked at it for a long time. Then another message appeared. Grace had gone back downstairs. I did not know whether Evan was still there when she asked it, but she later told me exactly what she said. "If Grandpa kept trying, why did you spend 10 years telling me he didn't want us?" Grace's question stayed with me long after the house had gone quiet. Not because I didn't know Evan had been angry with me. I did. Not because I believed I had handled those years perfectly. I hadn't. What bothered me was the possibility that I had spent a decade accepting a version of the past that was incomplete. The next morning, I went into my home office before sunrise. There was an old desktop computer in the corner that I rarely used anymore. Most of my current business was on newer systems, but I had kept the machine because it still contained archived emails from the years when Helen was sick. I had avoided opening those folders for a long time. Too many appointment reminders, too many messages from doctors, too many ordinary notes written during months that no longer felt ordinary when I looked back. I found the year Helen died and began scrolling. There were hundreds of email, business, insurance, funeral arrangements, messages from people I barely remembered. Then I found Evan's name. At first, nothing stood out. Short exchanges, a question about Grace, a note about something Helen had left at their house. Then I reached the weeks after the funeral, and there it was. The plan he had brought to my kitchen table. I opened the first attachment. It was a small commercial property outside Chicago. Evan wanted to acquire an aging retail building, renovate it, divide the space, and lease it to several tenants. It had been his first serious attempt to become a developer. The memory came back quickly once I saw the numbers. He had asked me to provide most of the cash required to get the deal started. I had forgotten how much because the amount had never been the important part to me. The problem was everything underneath it. The projected rents were too optimistic. The renovation estimate left almost no room for surprises. 2 potential tenants had expressed interest but signed nothing, and at that time, Whitaker was carrying more risk than Evan understood. Helen's illness had pulled me away from the company for months. We had delayed projects. One major customer was paying slowly. I was protecting payroll and trying not to let anyone at work feel how uncertain things had become. I had told Evan no, not forever, not to every idea, no to that deal. Reading my own email now, I could see that I had not been gentle. I wrote like a man reviewing a proposal, not like a father speaking to a grieving son. The numbers don't support the risk. You need stronger commitments before putting more capital into this. I cannot fund this as presented. Cold, clear, probably painful. Evan's replies became angrier with each message. He said I had spent his entire childhood finding money whenever Whitaker needed it. He said I could always justify taking a risk for the company, but never for him. Then I reached a sentence I remembered from our recent phone call. You did the same thing 10 years ago. At the time, I had heard it as another general accusation. Now I knew exactly what he meant. I kept scrolling. The final email was shorter than the rest. Only 4 lines. The third line stopped me. If you won't help us build our future, don't expect to be part of it. I read it twice, then a third time. For 10 years, I had remembered that period as a family falling apart after Helen died. A grieving son furious with an absent father, a widower too, ashamed to force his way back into a relationship he believed he had damaged. All of that was true, but it was not the whole truth. Evan had not simply walked away because I had failed him emotionally. He had connected my place in his life to whether I would finance the future he wanted. The cards Grace found suddenly looked different. So did the return packages. So did all those years when I told myself I was respecting a boundary. Maybe at some point it became a boundary, but it had begun as something else, a consequence. Say yes, and you are with us. Say no, and you are outside. I pushed away from the desk and went into the kitchen. The house looked exactly as it had the day before. Coffee maker, winter light, Helen's old ceramic bowl on the counter. Nothing had changed, except the story I had been telling myself. I was still responsible for the birthdays I missed when Evan was young, for the nights I answered work calls when I should have listened, for letting Helen do too much of the emotional work in our family. I would not erase those failures just because I had found an ugly email. But guilt was not the same thing as owing someone unlimited access to my money. And regret was not permission to punish me forever. I thought about Northline, the blue folder, the lender, the $1,300,000. Then I thought about Evan's first proposal sitting on my kitchen table 10 years earlier. The pattern was almost painfully simple. 10 years ago, saying no had cost me my son. If I paid him now, I would be teaching him that the punishment had finally worked. I stayed in the kitchen for a long time after closing the old email. Then I picked up my phone and called Marianne. She answered on the second ring. You're up early. So are you. I'm always up early. That's why I called. She laughed once. What happened? I want to put the succession work back in motion. There was a pause. The employee plan? Yes. Are you sure? No, I said. But I'm sure enough to keep moving. That was the truth. The idea had not appeared because Evan wanted money. Marianne and I had started exploring it about 18 months earlier, long before my son remembered my phone number. At first, it had been nothing more than a question. What happened to Whitaker when I no longer wanted to run it every day? I was 68. I was healthy, but I had lived long enough to stop pretending healthy meant permanent. We had looked at several possibilities: a strategic sale, a management buyout, a gradual employee ownership structure. The $27 million offer had been the most impressive number anyone put in front of me. It was also the easiest answer. Sell. Take the money. Walk away. The problem was what happened after I walked away. The buyer had been professional about it. They never lied to me. They wanted Whitaker's customer relationships, our contracts, our equipment, and our reputation in commercial interiors. What they could not promise was that all 60 people working for me would still have the same jobs 2 years later. Some functions would probably be consolidated: accounting, purchasing, parts of project management, maybe more. That was normal in an acquisition. Normal did not mean I had to choose it. During Helen's illness, I learned exactly how much of the company existed because other people kept carrying it when I couldn't. There were weeks when I spent more time in hospitals than at the shop. Marianne handled problems I normally would have handled myself. Supervisors stayed late without being asked. A foreman named Pete drove a completed sample to Detroit at 5 in the morning because I was sitting beside Helen during a bad night. Someone left casseroles on our porch so often that Helen once joked the company had accidentally entered the catering business. Those people were not my replacement family. I did not need one. Helen was my wife. Evan was my son. Employees were employees. But loyalty still counted for something. If I had the right to decide what happened to the company I built, then I also had the right to consider the people who helped build it with me. That was why Marianne and I had spent months exploring a gradual transition that could give employees a stake while allowing me to retain enough ownership and income to protect my own future. We had slowed the process when the acquisition offer arrived. $27 million deserved careful consideration. I had considered it. Then I said no. Later that afternoon, Marianne brought the old succession file into my office. Independent valuation notes, financing options, tax questions for the professionals to answer, possible timelines. Nothing about it was simple. That comforted me. Revenge was usually simple in your imagination. Real decisions were messy. This doesn't happen overnight, Marianne said. I know, and we don't accelerate it because you're angry. I know that too. She studied me. Do you? I looked at the file. Yes. That evening, I called Evan. I could have let him hear about the succession plan from someone else eventually. I decided not to. He answered with a guarded, "Dad, I want you to hear something from me before it gets around." What? I'm moving forward with the employee ownership work we started last year. Silence. Then, what employee ownership work? A long-term succession plan for Whitaker. How much of the company? We haven't finalized the structure. You're selling it to your employees? Gradually, if the numbers and financing make sense. Another silence. Longer this time. Then Evan said, "You turned down $27 million so you could give the company away?" I didn't say anything about giving it away. That's what this is. No. It would be a structured transaction. Dad, those people work for you. Yes. They're not your family. I know exactly who they are. His voice rose. So what happens to me? I leaned back in my chair. What do you mean? You know what I mean. No, Evan, say it. He took a breath. You're giving my inheritance to employees. For a second, I honestly thought I had misunderstood him. Then I realized I hadn't. My inheritance? Mom gave years of her life to that company. She did. And now you're going to hand it to people who clock in and go home? I'm considering selling ownership over time to people who helped create the value you keep talking about. You're punishing me. This process started 18 months before Christmas. Convenient. It's documented. He went quiet. I kept my voice even. Listen to me carefully. You cannot inherit a company whose owner is still alive. Evan did not answer, and for the first time, he was no longer asking me to help him. He was talking as though something I still owned had already become his. After Evan called Whitaker my inheritance, I did something I should have done before arguing with him. I checked the records, not because I doubted what I owned, but because I had learned that family arguments become dangerous when memory starts pretending to be law. Helen had helped me build Whitaker in the early years. Nobody could honestly deny that. She had handled bookkeeping from our kitchen table, answered customer calls when I was out measuring jobs, and kept our household running when the company demanded more of me than it should have. But contribution and legal ownership were not the same thing. After Helen died, her estate had been handled properly. Accounts were transferred, beneficiaries were paid, and every document requiring probate or legal review had been completed years ago. Whitaker Architectural Millwork remained mine. Evan owned no shares. He had no partnership interest. No hidden percentage had passed to him through Helen. There was nothing mysterious waiting in an old file cabinet. That did not make his feelings meaningless. It simply meant they were feeling, not ownership. I put the documents back where they belonged and tried to return my attention to work. 2 days later, I received another message from the lender working with Northline. The woman I had spoken with before said their underwriting team had come across material that appeared to connect me more directly to the project than my written clarification suggested. She attached the pages that referenced me and asked whether they accurately reflected my involvement. I opened the file. The first page loaded slowly. Then I saw my own face. For a moment, I thought Grace had sent me the wrong picture again. It was the Christmas photograph, the one from Evan's living room. Lauren in her cream sweater, Grace beside me, Evan's hand on my shoulder, me standing in the middle because Lauren had insisted that was where Dad belonged. I stared at it. Underneath the photograph was a polished caption. Three generations of the Whitaker family reunited for the holidays as Northline Development Group enters its next phase of growth. Nothing in that sentence was technically false. We had been reunited. Northline was pursuing growth, but placed together, the photograph and the wording created an impression far stronger than either one did alone. I scrolled. A few pages later, beneath a financing summary, I found another phrase. Family equity discussions progressing. Again, careful wording. Nobody wrote that I had invested. Nobody claimed I had signed anything. But if I had been an outside investor seeing that presentation, I would have understood exactly what they wanted me to think. The wealthy father was back. The family was together. The money was probably coming. I leaned away from the screen. Then I remembered Grace's message. This is the first real picture I've ever had with you. That sentence hurt differently now. To Grace, the photograph had meant she finally had proof that her grandfather existed inside her life. To me, it had meant maybe 10 years of silence were ending. To somebody reading Northline's materials, it meant confidence, continuity, family backing. I opened the original photograph on my phone and checked the timestamp, Christmas afternoon. Before dinner, before Evan asked about my company, before I mentioned the $27 million offer, before Lauren placed the blue folder in front of me, before I knew Northline needed $1 from me, Lauren had arranged us around that fireplace and taken the photograph, while I still believed the evening was simply about family. I remembered myself moving toward the edge of the group, her stopping me. No, Dad should be in the middle. At the time, I had thought it was kindness. Now I could not know what it had been. That uncertainty bothered me almost as much as the presentation itself. I called the lender. I've reviewed the material you sent. Does it accurately represent your participation? The photograph is real. And the family equity discussions? Northline discussed money with me. I did not commit any. I chose every word carefully. The fact that I attended Christmas dinner should not be interpreted as financial support. The photograph should not be interpreted as financial support. My relationship with my son does not represent backing from me or from Whitaker Architectural Millwork. She thanked me and said the clarification would be added to the file. I followed with an email so nobody would ever have to remember the conversation differently. Then I printed the investor page. I placed it beside the photograph Grace had sent me. Same smiles, same fireplace, same four people, two completely different meanings. For most of my life, I had believed money could complicate family. I had never imagined someone could turn family itself into part of a financing presentation. I looked again at my own smiling face in the center of the picture. They had taken proof that I was finally back in the family before they told me why they wanted me there. The next morning, I expected Evan to call angry. Instead, he called alone. No Lauren in the background, no careful language about family capital, no accusation about employees or inheritance. I was wrong, he said. I did not answer immediately. I shouldn't have used your name before you agreed to anything. I shouldn't have let the lender think you were further along than you were. There are sentences you wait years to hear from your child, even when they may come too late. That was one of them. Are you correcting it? I asked. Yes, not verbally. I know. By noon, I had a copy of the email he sent to the lender. It stated that I had made no investment commitment, that Whitaker Architectural Millwork was not a funding source, and that earlier references to family participation should not be treated as confirmed equity. It was not an apology to me. It was better than that. It was a correction that cost him something. For the first time since Christmas, I wondered whether Evan might actually be stepping back from the edge. He called again that afternoon. If you think the way we handled this was wrong, fine, he said. But I still want to know whether the project itself is bad. That's a different question. Then answer that one. I'll send you everything. Not the investor deck, the real packet. Debt terms, construction assumptions, operating projections. Why? Because you've been doing this longer than I have. That was the closest thing to humility I had heard from him in years. An hour later, the files arrived. I printed the important pages and spread them across my dining room table. The first thing I noticed was a lender notice dated before Christmas. Northline had been told it would need to prove the remaining sponsor equity before the financing could move toward closing. The date was December 15th. Evan had called me 2 days later. For 10 years, there had been silence. Then the bank asked him to prove where the missing money was coming from. 2 days later, my phone rang. The timing did not prove every motive behind the call, but it made coincidence difficult to believe. I kept reading. The full numbers were less attractive than the presentation Lauren had shown me. Construction costs had risen. The interest assumptions were optimistic, The contingency reserve was thin enough that one serious delay could consume it. There was more debt than the Christmas deck had made obvious, and several expected rents depended on tenants who had not signed final leases. None of that made the project fraudulent. It made it vulnerable. I rebuilt the financing model the way I would have for any large job at Whitaker. I stripped out my name. I stripped out any expected proceeds from a company sale. I removed every dollar nobody had actually committed. Then I ran the numbers again. The result was simple. Northline did not merely want $1,300,000 from me. They needed something very close to that amount from somebody. Without it, the project never satisfied the lender's required equity level. I leaned back and looked at the papers covering my table. If I invested, the deal might survive. If I guaranteed debt, the lender might become more comfortable. I had the power to solve the problem. That was what made the decision hard. I thought about Grace calling me Grandpa without hesitation. I thought about another Christmas dinner, a birthday phone call, Evan stopping by without needing anything. $1,300,000 was a great deal of money, but I had enough that losing it would not destroy me. For a few dangerous minutes, I found myself pricing the relationship instead of the investment. That frightened me. Evan drove to Grand Rapids the next day. We went through the numbers at my dining room table. He argued the project could still work if construction stayed on schedule and rents came in where they expected. I told him that was exactly the problem. Too many things had to go right at once. "So that's it?" he asked. "You won't do it?" "I won't invest." His jaw tightened. "What about a guarantee?" "No." He pushed back from the table. "You could save this. I could put my money behind it. That isn't the same thing. What are we supposed to do?" "I'll help you work through an orderly exit. Negotiate where you can. Protect what's left. Figure out which obligations matter first." He stared at me. "You'll help me quit. I'll help you avoid making a bad situation worse." He gathered the papers without speaking. At the front door, he stopped with one hand on the knob. Then he looked back at me. "We didn't need you for 10 years, Dad. We came because this time you could actually do something." By the next afternoon, I understood that Lauren had decided the numbers were not going to save Northline. So she changed the subject. My sister-in-law called first. "Sam, I don't want to get in the middle of anything. People usually say that when they are already standing in the middle." "What did you hear?" She hesitated. "That Evan and Lauren are in trouble. That you could help, but you're refusing because you're angry." I looked out my office window. "Did they tell you why the lender thought I was involved?" "No." "Did they tell you they used my name before I agreed to anything?" Another pause. "No." That became the pattern. A cousin emailed. An old family friend left a voicemail. One of Lauren's contacts, a man I had met twice at business functions, sent me a careful message about how family disagreements should not destroy good companies. The story traveling through people was simple. Sam Whitaker was wealthy. His son's business was struggling. Sam had turned down $27 million. Now he was moving ownership of Whitaker toward employees instead of helping his own child. Every piece contained enough truth to sound respectable. What was missing mattered more. Nobody mentioned that Evan had presented me as likely capital before asking. Nobody mentioned Lauren's attempt to reopen the sale of my company. Nobody mentioned the Christmas investor presentation. Nobody mentioned that the project did not have enough confirmed equity without money they expected from me. Evan called 2 days later. "You chose strangers over family." I had heard the phrase by then. I wondered how many times he had repeated it before deciding to say it directly to me. "The employee plan started before you came back. It doesn't change what you're doing now." "What am I doing?" "Giving people at Whitaker opportunities you won't give your own son. They work there, Evan." "So?" "So their ownership would be purchased through a structured plan. I'm not handing anyone $1 million because they asked." He gave a bitter laugh. "You always have a business explanation, and you always seem to need my money before you're willing to call me family." He hung up. That night, I opened my laptop and began writing an email. I addressed it to relatives, family, friends, and anyone I thought might have heard Lauren's version. I explained the lender, the equity gap, the old succession plan, the acquisition offer, the investor presentation. I wrote more than 2 pages. Then I read it from the beginning. It sounded like a man begging a room full of people to find him innocent. I deleted it. 10 years earlier, I might have needed everyone to understand me. Now I needed the people making decisions involving my name to understand the facts. That was enough. I sent brief corrections only where necessary. To the lender, to the former buyer, to one business contact who had been told Whitaker might support Northline. No speeches, no accusation, just dates and statements. A few days later, Grace called. She sounded uncomfortable. "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are Mom and Dad going to lose the house?" I sat down. "Why do you ask?" "Mom said if the project falls apart, everything could change." "That may be true. She said they've put a lot into it." "They have." Grace was quiet. Then she said, "Could you stop that from happening?" There it was. Not manipulation from Grace. Fear. A 17-year-old girl hearing adults talk about losing money and trying to find the nearest person who might make the fear disappear. Before I could answer, she said quickly, "Never mind, Grace. I'm not asking you for money. I know. I don't want them saying I asked. Listen to me. Your parents made business decisions. I made mine. None of that is your responsibility. But if you can help, I can do many things. That doesn't mean every one of them is the right thing to do." She breathed out slowly. "Am I supposed to pick a side?" "No." That answer came easily. "You are not responsible for protecting me from your parents, and you are not responsible for protecting them from me." I wanted her to hear that clearly. The adults had already used enough family relationships as leverage. She would not become another one. The following morning, an email arrived from the lender. Northline's deadline for proving the required equity was approaching. Before making a final decision on the financing file, the lender wanted everyone whose participation had been referenced to appear in one meeting. I read the invitation twice. There were several paragraphs about documentation, underwriting, and final clarification, but one sentence mattered. "We need Samuel Whitaker to speak for himself." The meeting was scheduled for 10 the next morning in a conference room at the lender's regional office. I arrived 15 minutes early. Evan and Lauren were already there. Lauren wore a dark blazer and had a leather portfolio open in front of her. Evan sat beside her with his arms folded. Across the table were the lender's senior credit officer and the outside investor who had been considering the remaining equity position. Nobody smiled when I walked in. I took the empty chair at the end of the table and placed one thin folder in front of me. That was all I brought. My written clarification, Evan's email, the message Lauren sent to the company that had offered to buy Whitaker, the investor page with our Christmas photograph. Nothing new. I did not need anything new. The lender began by explaining that Northline's financing remained conditional on verified equity and that the purpose of the meeting was to remove any uncertainty concerning my involvement. Lauren leaned forward. "I think some of this has become much more adversarial than it ever needed to be. We had a family discussion that developed into a misunderstanding." I said nothing. For once, I had no interest in correcting her first. The credit officer looked at me. "Mr. Whitaker, did you personally commit approximately $1,300,000 to the Northline project?" "No." "Did Whitaker Architectural Millwork commit funds?" "No." "Did you authorize Northline to represent proceeds from a possible sale of Whitaker as available family liquidity?" "No." Lauren shifted in her chair. Evan said, "Dad agreed to review the project." The credit officer turned toward him. "Reviewing a project and committing equity are different things." "I know that." "Then let's keep them separate." Evan looked at me. "You told me you'd look at it." "I did." I opened my folder and slid a printed email across the table. The sentence was short. "I will review the project and tell you what I think. This is not a commitment to invest or guarantee debt." The outside investor read it, then passed it to the credit officer. Lauren's voice tightened. "We never said he signed a commitment." The lender opened another document. "No." But Mr. Whitaker's anticipated participation appeared several times in materials used to explain the equity strategy. Then came Evan's earlier email. "My father is prepared to support the equity gap once we finish the family side of the discussion." Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Evan rubbed his thumb against the edge of the table. "That was badly worded." "It was inaccurate," I said. He looked at me. I did not look away. The lender turned to Lauren. "We also need to clarify the attempted reopening of the Whitaker acquisition." Lauren's expression changed. "That was exploratory. Were you authorized by Mr. Whitaker to contact the buyer?" "No." "Did Mr. Whitaker ask you to reopen discussions?" "No." She glanced toward me. I was trying to understand what options existed. "For money you did not own," I said. The credit officer raised a hand slightly, not to silence me, but to keep the meeting from becoming personal. Then he placed the Christmas investor update on the table. Seeing that photograph in print still unsettled me. All four of us smiling, me in the middle. The outside investor studied it. "You distributed this after Christmas?" Lauren answered. "Yes." "And at that point, Mr. Whitaker had not committed?" "No." "Then what was the purpose of including the photograph?" Lauren hesitated. "To show family continuity." The investor leaned back. Continuity with what? She had no good answer. The lender moved on. That was when the meeting stopped being about me. He opened a revised financial model. We removed every reference to Samuel Whitaker, Whitaker Architectural Millwork, and any potential proceeds connected to a company sale. Evan straightened. The lender continued. We also removed any anticipated family equity that has not been independently verified. The outside investor looked at the numbers. How much remains unfunded? The credit officer gave the amount. It was close to what I had calculated at my dining room table. More than Northline could cover from existing resources. Evan said, "We have options. Which ones are committed?" Silence. Lauren said, "We've had conversations. That is not committed equity." The outside investor closed the financial packet. "I'm not increasing my position." Lauren turned toward him. "The project works if we get through closing." "That is not the question," he said. "The question is whether the capital structure works before closing." The lender nodded. "Without Mr. Whitaker's presumed support, Northline does not satisfy the equity requirement." Evan looked at me then. There was anger in his face, but also something else. Desperation. "You could still fix this." I felt the room turn toward me. Months earlier, that moment might have broken me. "Not anymore. I'm not part of the financing," Lauren whispered. "Sam." I closed my folder. "I came because my name was used. I wanted the record corrected. It is corrected." The lender gave a slow nod. "Then unless Northline produces another qualified equity source, the financing will not close." The outside investor stood. "That's my position as well." Lauren followed me into the hallway after the meeting. "You just cost us everything." I stopped beside the elevator. "No," I said. "I refuse to become the thing you told everyone you already had." The doors opened. Behind us, I heard the lender speaking to Evan. "Your father's refusal didn't create this problem. It exposed it." For the first time, Evan stopped looking at me and looked at his own numbers. I left the lender's office with no sense of victory. That surprised me. For weeks, I had imagined what it would feel like to finally stand in a room where nobody could twist my words, borrow my name, or make me responsible for a promise I had never made. I thought clarity would feel clean. It did not. The elevator carried me down 12 floors, and by the time I reached the parking garage, all I could think about was Evan sitting at that conference table after the numbers turned against him. He was still my son. That fact did not change just because the lender finally understood the truth. I drove west toward Michigan under a hard gray sky. About an hour outside Chicago, I pulled into a rest area and shut off the engine. For a while, I sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel. My phone was on the passenger seat. Evan's name was still near the top of the call history. I did not call him. I did not call Grace either. There are moments when reaching out is kindness. There are others when reaching out is simply another way of trying to control what happens next. So I sat there until the cold started creeping through the truck doors, then continued home. Northline's collapse did not happen all at once. That would have been easier, in a strange way. First, the property purchase failed to close. Evan and Lauren lost most of the deposit they had already put down. There were legal fees, design fees, surveys, consultants, and other costs that could not be recovered simply because the deal died. Then the lender formally closed the financing file. The outside investor withdrew as well. A week later, I heard through Evan that neither of them wanted to review another Northline proposal anytime soon. Not because anyone had blacklisted them, because trust had become expensive. That was the part Evan and Lauren had never understood. They had treated credibility like something they could borrow from me. Once their own credibility was questioned, there was no quick way to buy it back. Northline had another smaller project in early planning. They froze it. Then came the practical decisions. A leased company vehicle went back. Office furniture was sold. Several outside contractors were released. A small warehouse space was given up. Lauren began canceling services and subscriptions that had made sense when they believed the company was expanding. None of it was dramatic enough for a courtroom scene. It was worse than that. It was ordinary. Every week, another piece of the future they had planned disappeared. Evan called me once during that period, not to apologize, to ask whether I would consider buying Northline's remaining assets so they could recover some of what they had lost. "No," I said. "What about the deposit?" "No. We may have to use more of the home equity line. That's your decision." He went quiet. "You really are going to let us take the whole hit?" I looked around my office, at the framed photograph of Helen, at the succession documents on my desk. "At some point," I said, "the people who make the decision have to carry the result." He hung up without answering. I did not enjoy that conversation either. I also did not change my mind. At Whitaker, the employee ownership work continued exactly as it had before Northline's failure. No faster, no slower. Marianne made sure of that. "We are not turning this into a revenge project," she told me. "I know. Then don't start making decisions because you want Evan to hear about them." She was right. So we followed the schedule. Valuation work, advisors, financing discussions. Nothing dramatic. Nothing designed to punish anyone. That mattered to me. If my company's future became another weapon in the fight with my son, then I would be making the same mistake he had. A few weeks passed before Grace called. She did not ask about Northline. She asked whether Helen had really made terrible pancakes. I laughed. "Who told you that?" "Dad. He's telling the truth." That turned into a 20-minute conversation about Helen's cooking. A few days later, Grace called again because she was thinking about college and wanted to know how I had chosen my career. Another time, she asked what kind of wood was easiest to work with. "Maple," I told her. "You always say maple. There's a reason." Those conversations did more for me than any apology could have done then. They were ordinary. No money, no pressure, no crises, just a grandfather and granddaughter learning how to speak to each other years too late. About a month after Northline began shutting down, I was leaving the shop when my phone buzzed. A message from Evan. 5 words. "Can we talk without Lauren?" Evan chose a diner almost exactly halfway between Grand Rapids and the western Chicago suburbs. Nothing fancy. Vinyl booths. Laminated menus. Coffee that tasted stronger than it needed to. The kind of place where nobody cared who owned what company or how much money anybody had. I arrived first. Evan came in 10 minutes later wearing jeans and a dark jacket. No portfolio, no laptop, no Lauren. He slid into the booth across from me and wrapped both hands around the coffee the waitress poured. For a while, neither of us said anything. Then he looked at me. "I was the one who told the lender you'd probably help." "I know. I mean, before Lauren put it in the presentation, before Christmas." I waited. He looked down at the table. "I told myself it wasn't a lie because I thought you would. That doesn't make it true." "No." The word came quietly. He took a breath. "I was also the one who told Lauren to see if the company buyer was still interested." That surprised me less than it would have a month earlier. "You asked her to contact them?" "Yes." "Why didn't you do it yourself?" He gave a tired smile. "Because I knew how it would look." At least he was honest about that. He continued, "I thought if the offer came back, you'd start thinking about selling again. Then helping us wouldn't feel like taking money out of your business. You were trying to solve my objection before I had even made it." "Yes." The waitress returned and asked if we wanted food. Evan ordered eggs and toast. I ordered nothing. I had already lost my appetite. "There's something else," he said after she walked away. I knew what it was before he spoke. "The cards." I nodded. "We kept some of them." "Some?" "More than a few." He rubbed one hand over his face. "At first, I told myself Grace was too young. I didn't want you coming back for a birthday or Christmas and then disappearing again." "I wasn't disappearing. I know that now." "You knew there were cards." "Yes." "You knew I was trying." His face tightened. "Yes." That answer hurt more than I expected. Not because it was new, because hearing him admit it removed the last place where misunderstanding could hide. I looked out the window at cars passing on the wet highway. "Why?" He did not answer right away. Then he said, "Because I was angry." "About what?" He looked at me again. "You know. I want to hear you say it." He sat back. "After Mom died, I came to you with that property deal. You said no. I thought after everything, after all the years you gave the company instead of us, you could finally choose me." I said nothing. "When you didn't, I wanted you to feel what it was like to lose family because of a decision." There it was. Not grief, not confusion, a decision. "You cut me out to punish me." At first, yes. "And Grace?" His eyes dropped. "She became part of it." That was the ugliest sentence he had said all morning because he did not dress it up. He simply admitted it. I let the silence sit between us. Then I said, "You were right about some things." He looked surprised. "I worked too much." "Dad." "No, I did. I thought of a school concert I had missed because a hotel installation had run late. A birthday dinner where I spent half the meal outside taking a call from a contractor. Vacations where I carried work papers into rooms where my family was trying to relax. Helen covered for me more than she should have. She explained me to you when I should have explained myself, She kept telling me that providing for a family and being present for one were not the same thing. Evan stared into his coffee. I gave you reasons to be angry with me, I said. I didn't give you the right to sell me back my own family. His eyes lifted. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then he nodded. I know. I believed him. At least, I believed he understood that much. The waitress brought his food. He barely touched it. We talked for another half hour. Not about Northline. Not about Whitaker. About Helen. About Grace. About the years we had both spent proving things to someone who was no longer there to see any of it. For the first time in a decade, the conversation did not feel like a negotiation. That frightened me in a different way. Hope can make you careless. Evan pushed his plate away. If I fix this, he said, I mean really fix it. With Grace, with you, everything. I waited. He hesitated, then asked, does that change what you're leaving me? The question hung there between the sugar packets and the cold coffee. I did not get angry. Anger would have been easier. Instead, I looked at my son and understood that confession and change were not the same thing. My estate is not part of our reconciliation, I said. He looked down. If we can't rebuild this without discussing what you get when I die, then we're not rebuilding it yet. I had waited 10 years for my son to admit he was wrong, and one question about my death told me the lesson still wasn't finished. The question about my will changed something between Evan and me, but not in the way I expected. I did not cut him off again. I also did not pretend the question had never been asked. For the first time, I let time do some of the work. Over the next several months, Northline finished shutting down. There was no dramatic bankruptcy announcement, no newspaper story, no crowd waiting to watch Evan and Lauren fail. They simply reached the point where keeping the company alive would have meant borrowing more money to protect an idea that was already finished. Evan took a salaried operations job with a larger development firm outside Chicago. The first time he told me about it, I almost smiled when he complained about his new boss. He wants everything documented, Evan said. That sounds terrible. He caught the joke. Yeah, I hear it now. His new job came with deadlines, budgets, approvals, and projects funded by people who had actually agreed to provide the money. He no longer got to treat confidence as commitment. Lauren returned to design and project management work for another company. They sold their larger house and moved into a smaller place several miles away. Grace changed bedrooms, not schools. They canceled trips, sold a second vehicle, and stopped living as though the next successful project would always arrive in time to cover the last one. None of it ruined them. It simply forced them to live inside the consequences of their own decisions. A month after the move, I received copies of 2 written corrections. One went to the lender. The other went to the outside investor. Both acknowledged that I had never committed money to Northline, and that earlier references to anticipated Whitaker participation should not have been treated as confirmed financing. Evan signed one. Lauren signed the other. They did not send the letters to impress me. By then, those business relationships were gone. That was why the corrections mattered. Lauren asked to meet me a few weeks later. We sat at a quiet coffee shop near my office. She looked different without the confidence she had worn at Christmas. Not defeated, just less polished around the edges. I owe you an apology that doesn't include Evan, she said. I waited. I kept telling myself I was only presenting possibilities, but I treated your name like something Northline could use before you gave permission. I treated your money the same way. She looked directly at me. That was wrong. I appreciated that she did not say Evan made her do it. I accept the apology. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. Then I added, that doesn't change the boundaries. I understand. She would not receive Whitaker financial information. She would not be included in succession discussions. Neither she nor Evan would speak for me again. An apology could reopen conversation. It did not automatically restore access. At Whitaker, our employee ownership work moved forward slowly. Independent advisors completed the valuation. Financing was arranged for the first phase. I retained enough ownership to protect my income and keep a meaningful role while younger people began taking more responsibility. It was not a giveaway. Nobody woke up one morning owning the company because I was angry with my son. The employees would earn and purchase their stake through a structured plan. That distinction mattered to me. We also created a small scholarship for people entering skilled trades. I named it after Helen. For once, her name was attached to an opportunity instead of an argument. The first recipients would be students studying woodworking, drafting, machining, and related trades at local programs. I wish she could have seen it. A few weeks after the first ownership phase was announced, Evan came to Grand Rapids. He attended the event quietly. He did not ask where his place was. He did not ask whether there was a job waiting for him. He shook hands with people who had worked beside me for decades and congratulated them. Afterward, he asked if I wanted coffee. We went to a diner near the shop. Nothing important was discussed. That may have been what made it important. He told me about his boss. I told him about Grace asking whether I could teach her to use a hand plane. We complained about traffic. When the check came, I reached automatically for my wallet. Evan put his hand over the bill. "I've got it. It's coffee." "I know. I can afford coffee." He smiled. "I know that too." Something about the moment made me stop. For years, every financial conversation between us had involved amounts large enough to change lives. Now my son was insisting on paying $12, so I put my wallet away. "Thank you." He paid the bill. No speech followed. No favor. No question about Whitaker. No mention of my will. By the time the next Christmas approached, I had finally learned not to treat every good moment as a promise and not to expect anything from family photographs. Then Grace lifted her phone and smiled at me. "Grandpa, get in the middle." Grace's words stopped me for half a second, not because I did not want the picture, because I remembered the first one, the fireplace, Lauren's phone, Evan's hand on my shoulder, me standing in the middle and believing that being placed there meant I had finally been welcomed back. A year later, the room looked different, not because I had remodeled anything, because I had. I was working fewer hours at Whitaker now. Most mornings I still went in, but I no longer felt the need to be the first truck in the lot and the last light burning in the office. Younger managers were making decisions I once would have kept for myself. I spent more time teaching than directing. Sometimes that meant showing an apprentice why maple tore out when a blade was set wrong. Sometimes it meant sitting with a project manager and letting him solve a problem without reaching across the desk to solve it first. The scholarship in Helen's name had taken on a life of its own. I attended the first student interviews and met young men and women who reminded me why I had loved the trade before it became a company. I had also started having lunch with two men I used to work beside 30 years earlier. For a long time, I told myself I was too busy for things like that. The truth was simpler. I had spent too much of my life waiting for one relationship to become whole again. My house no longer felt like a waiting room. That Christmas, Evan, Lauren, and Grace drove in from Illinois the afternoon before dinner. They had reserved their own hotel. Evan told me that before I could offer the guest room. "We're good, Dad. It's already paid for." A year earlier, I might have argued. This time, I only said, "All right." There was no folder under Lauren's chair, no laptop bag beside Evan, no carefully placed questions about company ownership. Lauren brought a pie. Grace brought me a framed photograph from one of her school events. Evan brought an old woodworking book he found at a used bookstore because he remembered seeing a copy in my shop when he was a boy. None of the gifts were expensive. That made them feel better. Dinner was quieter than the previous Christmas. Not awkward, just ordinary. Grace talked about college applications. Lauren told a story about a client who had changed a kitchen design 6 times and still claimed the final version had been her original idea. Evan complained about a project schedule. I asked whether his boss still wanted everything documented. He looked at me. Lauren laughed before he did. "Don't encourage him, Sam." Nobody mentioned Northline. Nobody mentioned the lender. Nobody mentioned the $27 million offer. Most importantly, nobody mentioned my will. After dinner, Grace stood near the fireplace and raised her phone. "Grandpa, get in the middle." I looked at her. "You sure?" "Yes." Evan gave me a small smile. "You heard her." I stepped between them. Lauren stood on Grace's other side. This time, nobody arranged my shoulders. Nobody told me where to look. Grace set the timer and hurried into place. The camera flashed. Then she checked the screen. "That one's good." I walked over. It was. Not because we looked perfect. We did not. My eyes were half narrowed from the flash. Evan's tie had shifted. Lauren was holding back a laugh. Grace was leaning into me slightly. It looked like people who had actually spent the evening together. A week later, Grace mailed me a printed copy. No caption, no company logo. No investor received it. No banker saw it. It existed because she wanted it to exist. I put it beside an older photograph of Helen in the living room. That was enough. My boundaries had not changed. Evan did not have a guaranteed position at Whitaker. Lauren did not receive company information because she was family. My estate plan remained private. If Evan and Lauren had another financial emergency, it would be theirs to solve. Nothing about Christmas erased what had happened. That mattered. Forgiveness without memory is just another way to become easy to use. But memory did not have to become a prison either. Later that evening, Evan and Lauren gathered their coats. Grace hugged me first. Lauren wished me good night and thanked me for dinner. Evan waited until they were almost through the doorway. Then he turned back and hugged me. "Good night, Dad." For 1 second, an old reflex returned. I waited for the next sentence. The request, the problem, the number. Nothing came. He simply stepped onto the porch. "Drive safe tomorrow," he said. "I will." I watched them walk toward the car, then closed the door. The house became quiet again, but quiet no longer meant abandoned. I went into the living room and looked at the new photograph beside Helen's. For the first time in 10 years, my son called me Dad, and I didn't have to wonder what it was going to cost me.